Hey guys, Karenology here. Get ready because this story is pure chaos from start to finish.
The letter from the homeowner association arrived in a crisp white envelope, stamped with an urgent notice. Your property is no longer yours. Vacate immediately. I held it in my hands, rereading the words, waiting for them to make sense. They didn't. 2 months ago, I had finalized the purchase of this land, my dream lot where I planned to build the house I had been designing for years. A piece of property in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, free from the chaos of city life. Now, according to the HOA, my ownership was nothing more than a clerical error, a mistake that needed to be corrected. But this wasn't a mistake. It was a coordinated attack. I stormed into the HOA office the next morning, gripping the deed to my land. Behind the desk sat Karen Bennett, the iron-fisted enforcer of neighborhood policies. She adjusted her reading glasses, barely glancing up at me before flipping through some files. "Michael, it's really quite simple. The property was never supposed to be sold. The previous owner made an error in the transfer, and now we need to correct it," she said with an exasperated sigh. I slammed the deed onto her desk. "This paper says otherwise. I have a legal right to that land." Karen smiled, the kind of smile people use when they already know they've won. "You may think that, but according to our revised records, the land is listed under HOA management. You see, our community agreements prevent individual ownership of certain lots. Your lot is one of them. That wasn't in the contract when I bought it, because it should never have been sold in the first place. Something was off. I had combed through the paperwork before purchasing the land, and nothing had indicated any HOA control over it. I wasn't about to let them take it without a fight. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. My mail began arriving late, if at all. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries now avoided eye contact. Then came the fines, one after another, for ridiculous infractions. An unauthorized fence, though I had built none. A penalty for neglected landscaping, despite the fact that the lot was empty. They were tightening their grip, hoping to choke me out. One evening, my neighbor Greg caught me in the driveway. He was in his 60s, had lived here long before the HOA became a powerhouse. He glanced around nervously before speaking. They did the same thing to the Johnsons, bought a lot, and 6 months later, the HOA forced them out, took them to court, drained them dry. I frowned. What happened to them? Greg sighed. They left, cut their losses. I wasn't going to be like the Johnsons. That night, I dug deeper. I requested old HOA meeting records, but they were unavailable. I searched through public land registries, and that's when I found it. Something odd. My lot had been transferred twice before, both times to individuals who had mysteriously backed out, selling the property right back to the HOA at a loss. They were running a scam. Selling lots, then strong-arming buyers into forfeiting their rights so the HOA could reclaim them. I needed proof. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The clerk, a tired-looking woman, barely glanced up as I requested documents related to my property. She typed in a few numbers, then paused, frowning at the screen. "That's strange," she muttered. "Your lot has multiple ownership histories, but there are inconsistencies." I leaned in. "What kind of inconsistencies?" She hesitated, then printed out several documents. "It looks like your lot was reclassified 3 years ago as part of an HOA community preservation effort. That designation means they technically hold administrative rights over the land, even if it's privately owned. But this wasn't properly recorded. The sale to you should never have gone through." I exhaled sharply. "So they messed up? More than that, if you challenge them with this, they'll have a problem on their hands." I took the documents and left, a plan forming in my mind. The HOA wanted me gone. They thought I would fold like the others. But I had something they didn't expect. I had proof, and I wasn't leaving. I spent the entire night going through the documents I had obtained from the county records office, highlighting inconsistencies, cross-referencing dates, and making notes in the margins. The more I read, the more certain I became. This was a coordinated scam. The HOA was selling lots, allowing buyers to finalize purchases and then systematically forcing them out through intimidation, bogus fines, and legal loopholes. They weren't just making mistakes. They were running an operation. By the time the sun came up, I had compiled enough evidence to at least put up a fight. But a fight meant nothing without a strategy. If I marched into the HOA office and threw accusations, they'd lawyer up, stall, and bury me in legal fees. I needed leverage, and I needed to find out who in this neighborhood was on my side, if anyone at all. I knocked on Greg's door later that morning, holding the thick file of documents under my arm. He looked uneasy as he let me in, peering down the street before shutting the door behind me. I laid the documents on his kitchen table, flipping through pages as I spoke. I explained the fraudulent transactions, the forced buybacks, the intimidation tactics. Greg rubbed his temples and sighed heavily. I knew they were bad, but this is something else. I leaned forward. They forced out the Johnsons. Who else? Greg hesitated, then stood and shuffled through a drawer, eventually pulling out a small notebook. The Millers, the Sanchez family, even Old Man Porter before he passed. Every single one of them got squeezed out. Some took settlements just to get the hell away. Others fought until they went broke. My stomach twisted. And no one ever took them to court? Greg scoffed. You think anyone around here has the money to take on the HOA's legal team? They drag things out for years. Most people just fold. I clenched my jaw. That's exactly what they wanted me to do. What about you? How have you managed to stay? Greg smirked bitterly. I was here before the HOA. My house is one of the last ones built before they took over the land. They've tried, but I have some old loopholes in my deed they haven't figured out how to override. They hate me for it. I nodded. Greg was proof that the HOA wasn't invincible. There were cracks in their system, and I just needed to find the right one to break them apart. But first, I had to survive whatever retaliation was coming my way. That afternoon, my mailbox was stuffed with new violation notices. The latest claimed my lot was a public nuisance due to excessive debris and hazardous conditions. It was empty land. I hadn't even placed a single rock on it. They were escalating. Later that night, as I sat on my porch, a pair of headlights flickered at the end of my street. The car had been idling there for nearly an hour. When I stood up, it slowly drove off. I felt the weight of paranoia pressing down on me, but I knew it wasn't paranoia if they were actually after me. The next day, I decided to push back. If they were going to bury me in paperwork, I'd return the favor. I filed a formal complaint with the State Housing Board, outlining every violation I had uncovered. I also contacted a local investigative journalist, an old college friend, and gave her a rundown of what was happening. If I was going down, I wasn't going quietly. A few days passed without incident, but then the first real threat arrived. An official-looking envelope was slipped under my door. Inside was a legal notice claiming I was being sued for defamation by the HOA. The wording was heavy, the demands absurd. Cease all accusations, pay a hefty fine, and issue a public apology. I laughed. They were scared. Greg was at my door 15 minutes later, holding his own copy of the same letter. They think they can scare us off, he said, shaking his head. They have no idea who they're dealing with. The problem was, neither did I. Because if they were willing to fabricate fines, manipulate records, and run people out of town, I had to wonder, just how far were they willing to go to protect their scheme? That night, I double-checked every lock on my house and slept with a hammer under my pillow. I was officially at war with the HOA. The lawsuit was nothing more than a scare tactic, but it still carried weight. If the HOA dragged me into court, I could lose everything. Not just my lot, but my savings, my time, my sanity. Fighting them was like punching water. Every move I made was swallowed by an unrelenting force, but I wasn't backing down. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd play smarter. I spent the next few days preparing my counterattack. I compiled every piece of evidence I had: emails, documents, photos of my pristine, empty lot that they had claimed was a public nuisance. I sent copies to the housing board, the county office, and even a few law firms that specialized in property disputes. Most of them brushed me off, unwilling to take on the HOA's well-funded legal team. But one firm, a smaller but aggressive group known for challenging corporate corruption, agreed to take a look. Their initial assessment: the HOA had overstepped, but proving it in court would be an uphill battle. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. My mailbox was stuffed daily with new violations, ludicrous infractions like excessive weeds on my empty lot, failure to maintain aesthetic consistency, even though I hadn't built a house yet. Then came the more serious intimidation. My car's tires were slashed one night. A shadowy figure stood across the street from my house for hours, watching. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. They took a report, shrugged, and left. They weren't going to help me. Greg and I met in his garage one evening, his voice low. "They're trying to break you, just like they did the others." I nodded. "But why? Why go through all this trouble? They could have just offered me a buyout." Greg scratched his chin. "Because it's not just about money. It's about control. They need to keep the power structure intact. If one person successfully resists them, it sets a precedent. Others might start questioning things too." That made sense. But there was something deeper at play. If this was just about control, why the underhanded deals? Why the fraudulent lot transfers? I needed to dig deeper. I needed to go beyond just my case and figure out what the HOA was really hiding. That night I broke into the HOA office. I had spent days watching their patterns, who stayed late, who came in early. Karen Bennett, of course, was the last to leave every night. But on Friday evenings she had a routine. Locked up at exactly 7:30, then drove to the country club across town. That gave me a window. I had no experience picking locks, so I went the brute force route. A well-placed crowbar to the side door's weak frame. I was in. The office was eerily quiet, the air thick with the smell of old paper and printer toner. I moved fast, rifling through filing cabinets looking for anything tied to my lot. What I found was worse than I had imagined. A thick folder labeled Lot Recovery Program. Inside were records dating back nearly a decade. Dozens of lots, just like mine, bought by individuals, then recovered by the HOA through fraudulent means. Some were resold at inflated prices. Others, they were simply listed as retained for community development, a vague term that could mean anything. Then I found a separate file, one with my name on it. Inside were notes detailing my purchase, my complaints, and, chillingly, a list of escalation protocols that had already been deployed against me. The fake fines, the intimidation, the lawsuit, it was all part of a calculated strategy. I took photos of everything, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. Then I heard a noise outside. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Heart pounding, I slipped out the back just as a flashlight beam swept across the office. I barely made it to my car before a figure appeared at the front entrance. "Karen." She looked around suspiciously but didn't see me. I drove off, my pulse hammering. Greg's eyes widened when I showed him the photos. "This is it. This is the proof. They can't explain this away." I wasn't so sure. "They'll try, and if they know I have it, they'll do worse than just fines and slashed tires." Greg exhaled sharply. "Then we go public. We take this to the press, the courts, hell, even social media. We make it too big for them to contain." I nodded. That was the only way. But I had a sinking feeling we had just crossed a line we couldn't step back from. The HOA wasn't just playing legal games anymore. They were out for blood. The morning after the break-in, I woke up to an eerie silence. My phone, which had been buzzing non-stop with emails and messages, was dead. Not just out of battery, it completely wiped. The SIM card was missing. I checked my laptop. The screen flickered to life, but my files, my notes, my photos of the stolen documents, all gone. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. This wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone had been in my house while I slept. I ran outside, scanning the street. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Greg's car was still in his driveway, but something felt off. I knocked on his door, heart pounding. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. After a few moments, the door creaked open. Greg stood there, eyes bloodshot, his face pale. He didn't say a word, just motioned for me to come inside. His living room was a mess. Papers scattered, drawers yanked open as if someone had ransacked the place. He collapsed onto the couch, rubbing his temples. "They came last night," he muttered. "Didn't take anything valuable. Just my files, my notes on the HOA. They wanted to send a message." My stomach turned. "Did you see who it was?" He shook his head. "Didn't have to. We both know who it was. They're done playing games." I sat down, running a hand through my hair. "They wiped my phone, erased everything. They want us to back off." Greg let out a bitter laugh. "Then we hit them harder. We still have the hard copies of those documents, right? The ones you took." I hesitated. I stashed them in my garage, but if they got to our homes, they might have found them." We sprinted across the street to my place. The lock on my garage was still intact, but my gut told me we weren't that lucky. I forced the door open, stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline. I flipped the light switch. My workbench, where I had hidden the files, was reduced to a pile of ashes. The fire had been small, contained, but enough to destroy everything. Greg clenched his fists. "They burned them. They actually burned them." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my head clear. They must have been watching us. They knew where we hid them. Greg turned to me, voice low. "We need to get out of here, now." We drove to the only place we could think of, the office of the small law firm that had agreed to take a look at our case. The receptionist gave us a strange look when we arrived, practically shoving our way inside. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves, but your case has been dropped. Our attorneys won't be representing you." I stared at her. "What? They agreed to help. We have a case." She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I can't give details, sir. I was told to inform you that we will not be moving forward. Please leave." Greg grabbed my arm before I could say something I'd regret. We left, the weight of reality sinking in. "They got to them too," he muttered as we stepped back onto the street. "Bribed them, threatened them. Something." I clenched my jaw. "Then we go to the press." Greg didn't answer right away. His face had gone pale again. I followed his gaze. Across the street, a black SUV sat idling. The windows were tinted, but I could feel the eyes on us. The moment I moved, the SUV pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Greg exhaled. "They're watching us." I nodded, pulse racing. "Then let's give them something to watch." That night, we worked from Greg's basement, setting up burner phones, encrypting files, backing up everything we had left. If we were going to take this public, we needed to do it smart. Greg had contacts with a few journalists, people who had dug into corporate corruption before. We sent out everything, the documents I had photographed before they were erased, notes on the fraudulent lot acquisitions, even details on how they were intimidating homeowners. We packaged it all and waited. The response came faster than expected. One journalist, a bulldog of a reporter named Laura Banks, replied within an hour. She wanted to meet in person. We chose a public place, a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. When we arrived, Laura was already waiting, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. She looked up as we slid into the booth. "I read everything you sent me. If this is real, it's bigger than just your lot. This could take down the entire HOA." Greg leaned forward. "It's real. The problem is they know we're onto them. They're watching us, trying to shut us down." Laura took a slow sip of coffee. "Good, that means they're scared." I pulled out a fresh USB drive with everything we had left. "Can you get this out before they stop you?" She smiled. "I can try. But you two need to be ready for what comes next. Because once this goes public, they'll come at you with everything they have." Greg and I exchanged a look. We already knew that. As we stepped out of the diner, I spotted the same black SUV parked down the street. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. We drove back in silence, the weight of what we had just set in motion pressing down on us. The streets felt emptier than usual, the shadows darker. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I turned onto my block. I didn't want to admit it out loud, but I knew, once this story broke, the HOA wouldn't just sit back and let us watch them burn. They were going to hit back, hard. Greg exhaled sharply as we pulled into my driveway. We need to be ready. Once Laura publishes, we won't have time to react. They'll come fast. I nodded, already thinking about what we could do. We need backup plans. We need copies of everything hidden in multiple places. If they take us out of the picture, the story has to keep moving. Greg tapped his fingers on his knee. I'll reach out to some people. If this goes sideways, we can't be the only ones holding the evidence. I stepped out of the car, scanning the street. The black SUV was gone. That didn't make me feel any safer. We went inside and got to work, sending out encrypted copies of our files to trusted contacts. We set up automated posts that would release everything if we didn't check in within 24 hours. It was overkill. Or at least, I wanted to believe it was. At 6 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Laura. The article is live. It's spreading fast. You need to be careful. I barely had time to respond before Greg shouted from the other room. You need to see this. I ran to the living room. The news was already covering it. HOA fraud exposed. Illegal land grabs, harassment, intimidation. Photos of documents, victim testimonies, everything we had given Laura was now public. The HOA was scrambling. Their official statement was weak, a generic denial full of legal jargon. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Then the phone rang again. Not Laura this time. An unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A low voice came through the speaker. You don't know what you've done. My blood went cold. Who is this? You think this is over? We're just getting started. The call ended. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Greg saw my face. What? What happened? I swallowed hard. They're coming. Less than an hour later, the retaliation began. The power in my house cut out. My internet went dead. Greg's place, too. We checked our phones. No service. Isolated. We weren't going to be able to call for help. A car rolled slowly down the street. Not the black SUV this time. Something else. Tinted windows, no plates. It stopped 2 houses down. Doors opened. 3 men stepped out dressed in plain, dark clothes, moving with purpose. Not cops. Not hired security. Something worse. Greg grabbed my arm. We need to move. Now. We slipped out the back door, cutting through yards, hopping fences. We had no destination, only the need to get away. My mind raced, trying to figure out our next step. The story was out, but we were still in danger. The HOA wasn't going down without taking us with them. Then, out of nowhere, sirens. Flashing lights. A line of squad cars tore down the street, stopping right in front of my house. Officers swarmed the neighborhood, weapons drawn, barking orders. I heard shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. Then I saw them, Karen Bennett and 2 other board members being hauled out in cuffs. The men in dark clothes, gone. Greg let out a breath. Did we just win? I wasn't sure how to answer that. The HOA was finished, at least this chapter of it. But I knew better than to think it was over. And this kind of corruption didn't die overnight. Someone else would take their place. Some other scheme would rise. I looked down at my phone. Service was back. A message from Laura. This is just the beginning. Greg patted my shoulder. You still want that house? I laughed, shaking my head. I think I've had enough of this neighborhood. As we walked away, I didn't look back. Some fights you win, others you survive.